I almost kept walking. That's the part I have to live with. I was doing my corridor rounds on the fourth floor, the same loop I've made 1,000 times, past the nurse's station, past the ICU bay doors, past the alcove with the vending machine that hasn't worked since March. I had a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I was paying just enough attention to not walk into a cart. So I saw it. I just didn't understand what I was seeing. Martin Foss, one of the supply clerks, a decent enough man in ordinary circumstances, was walking in scrubs toward the supply corridor near the stairwell. She had a tote bag over one shoulder and a small laminated binder tucked under her arm. She was walking without protest. She was walking the way I have seen people walk out of rooms they know they are not going to see again. Straight, backed, measured, eyes forward. Foss said something low to her. She nodded once and stopped near the corridor door. I glanced back toward the ICU waiting area. A man in a charcoal blazer stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. Early 50s, the kind of tan you get from leisure rather than labor. He was watching her go with an expression that was not cruel exactly, but was cruel's close cousin satisfied. The matter resolved, I thought, personnel issue. Not my territory. I nearly kept walking. What stopped me was her face when she turned to put her back against the wall. There was no distress in it, no anger. There was only a stillness I recognized from a long time ago, from men I had served alongside as a Navy corpsman in a different life, men who had learned to hold the hardest things quietly because there was no one around to put them down with. She stood the way a person stands when they have absorbed worse and are simply waiting for this to pass. I stopped. I got out of the way of a meal cart, and I stayed where I was, and I watched. Her name, I would learn later, was Dorothy Crane. She had been on the fourth floor for 2 years. Before that, she had 22 years of service I did not know about, and the ICU charge nurse told me afterward she had never once heard Dorothy mention any of it. The patient in Bay 4 was an older man, late 70s, a retired master sergeant named Edmund Aldrin. His son, the man in the charcoal blazer, had filed a formal complaint that afternoon, citing a communication failure. He wanted new staff on his father's care. He had spoken to the charge nurse, who had spoken to the supervisor, who had spoken to Foss, and the machinery of institutional compliance had done what it always does. It moved the path of least resistance. And Dorothy Crane was it. What none of them knew, and what I did not know, was what she kept folded in the inner pocket of her tote bag. 18 minutes after Martin Foss walked her out of Bay 4, the monitor in that room sent a tone down the corridor I have learned to recognize in 20 years of hospital ministry, not the loud alarm of a crash, the quieter, insistent pulse of something going wrong in a way the machine cannot quite categorize. The staff who hear it most clearly are the ones who have heard it long enough to feel it in their sternum first. The trauma team was down on 2. A 4-car accident on the interstate had come through the bay doors 40 minutes earlier, and every attending who could run a code was 3 floors below us. The charge nurse was on the phone. The monitor kept its tone. Dorothy Crane was still in the supply corridor. I do not know what she heard or how she read it. I know only that when I looked toward the corridor, she was already moving, and she was moving with the unhurried certainty of someone who had made that calculation before. She did not ask. She pushed through the Bay 4 door, and I followed, because I am a chaplain, and Bay 4 held a man who might be dying, and that is my territory regardless of personnel disputes. What I saw in the next 4 minutes, I will not pretend to fully understand. I have stood in rooms where good nurses and good doctors worked, and I know the rhythm of it. The controlled urgency, the called numbers, the hands that know their purpose. What I saw in Dorothy Crane was a different register of that same thing. She was at the bedside before I had cleared the doorway. She had the monitor read out in a single glance, and she was already reconfiguring the leads. Speaking to the old man in a voice, so even it took me a moment to understand, she was also issuing instruction to herself, a quiet running account of what she was seeing, what she was adjusting, what she was ruling out. She worked from the tote bag. Items I could not have named. Techniques I had no framework for. At one point, she braced the heel of her hand at a specific angle against the old man's sternum and held a count. Not compressions, something more deliberate than that. A maintained pressure at an interval she was timing in her head, and the monitor tone shifted. He gripped her wrist. He had been barely conscious, eyes not quite focused, but he gripped her wrist with the grip of a man who has spent a life working with his hands, and he turned his face toward her. He said something I could not hear from where I stood. She leaned down. She answered him. When she straightened, she reached into the tote bag a final time and set a small folded square of cloth on the rail of the bed, not unfolding it, just placing it where his hand could find it. The attending, Dr. Ramirez, came through the door at a run 2 minutes 50 seconds after Dorothy Crane had started. I know because I had checked my watch when the tone changed. He took one look at the monitor, one look at the old man's color, one look at Dorothy Crane. He said quietly, "What did you do?" She told him. Level voice, deliberate sequence, no editorializing. He listened. When she finished, he put his hand on the rail and looked at the monitor for a long moment. He said, "That's right." He said it the way you say a thing when you have just understood that you are standing next to someone you did not know was in the room. I stepped into the corridor. Craig Aldrin was there now, the man in the charcoal blazer, because the tone had brought him out of the waiting room. He was standing 15 feet from the bay door with his phone half raised, looking uncertain in the particular way that entitlement looks when it has miscalculated. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened. 6 men came off it. Dress uniform, army greens, carrying ribbons on the chest like a ledger of what a person has paid for. They were not young men. The one in front was a colonel. And I knew that not from reading his insignia, but from the way the others arranged themselves around him without being told. He was perhaps 65, silver at the temples, with a walk that occupied space without needing to announce itself. They came down the corridor without hurry, and they stopped outside Bay 4. The colonel looked at me. I stepped aside. Dorothy Crane came out of the bay and stopped. For the first time since I had seen her that afternoon, the stillness in her face changed. It did not become distress. It became something harder to name, recognition, maybe, and the effort of receiving something she had not expected. The colonel reached into his breast pocket and unfolded a single sheet of paper. He read it aloud. I will not reproduce the words here. They are not mine to carry, but I will say that the document cited a theater, a time frame, a number of men, and the methods of a woman who had improvised the care that kept them alive through 61 days without resupply. It cited her rank. It cited her name. When he finished reading, he folded the paper with both hands and held it out to her, and then he saluted. The 5 men behind him saluted from inside Bay 4 through the glass. The old man in the bed, Edmund Aldrin, Master Sergeant, retired, raised his right hand from the rail and held it at his brow. He had found the folded patch. He was holding it against his chest with his other hand. I heard a sound behind me and turned. Craig Aldrin had lowered his phone. He was looking at his father through the glass. He was looking at the 6 men in dress uniform. He was looking at Dorothy Crane, accepting the folded paper with both hands, her posture as straight and composed as it had been in the supply corridor, as it had been every moment I had watched her. He could not seem to find a place to put his eyes. I have been a chaplain for 19 years. I have sat with people at the edges of things, the edge of dying, the edge of grief, the edge of the life they thought they were living, and the life that turned out to be true. I have learned to be useful in those moments and to stay out of the way of larger ones. I stood in that corridor and understood that I had nearly walked past something I would carry the rest of my life. I am glad I stopped.